Hi, I'm Bridget. Welcome to my kitchen. Stew with biscuits is one of my favorite comfort food meals. Stew is hearty, it's warming, and it sets you up to enjoy leftovers. Biscuits give you something to sop up the broth and are always a welcome treat straight from the oven at mealtime. Join me today as we make both, a golden chicken stew and buttery molasses biscuits. Today we're making a chicken stew with chickpeas. I call it golden chicken stew because I add a little bit of turmeric to give it a beautiful yellow color. I like to use bone-in chicken thighs because I think they have more flavor and I prefer the texture, especially when they're cooked in a broth. Now to start things off, I am going to brown these in a few tablespoons of oil. I've removed the skin because I don't think we need the extra fat. I have 6 chicken thighs here. You could use 8, depending on how big your pot is. We don't want to crowd them in the pot where they're browning. I'm browning them on both sides, and it's just a few minutes per side. You'll want a full apron when you're browning your chicken because the oil is going to splatter up a lot. I'm removing the chicken to a plate once it's browned because I want lots of room in the pan to get the vegetables started. I've got 1 full onion that I've diced. We're just going to let that soften a bit before I start adding some of the other vegetables. I use a good sturdy Dutch oven that holds the heat well, and also it gives me the flexibility to finish cooking this stew in the oven with the lid on. Now that the onion is starting to soften, I'm going to add 3 cloves of garlic. I'm pressing them, but you could chop them as well, or mince them, I guess. You could add more or less garlic depending on your preference. But there are going to be lots of other ingredients in this stew, so garlic is not going to overpower everything. The nice thing about browning the chicken first is that there are these little caramelized bits in the bottom of the pan that I'm going to be able to pick up as I add more to the pot, especially when I start to add liquid. Now that the onion is starting to brown, I am going to add 1 chopped pepper and 1 sliced zucchini. I'm going to cover these veggies for a little bit and let them steam just so they'll cook a little faster. I will stir them from time to time, and this will just take another 5 minutes or so, and then we can start adding the remainder of the ingredients. The vegetables are getting soft now. They're not fully cooked, but they'll have lots of time to cook in the broth. So I am going to add 3 tablespoons of flour. And this flour is going to help thicken the broth while the stew cooks. So it will be a nice, thick, hearty stew. And now that our flour is all mixed in, I'm going to add 2 teaspoons of an Italian herb blend. You could use oregano in place of the Italian blend if that's all you have. I'm going to add a teaspoon of turmeric. This will add kind of some grounding notes to the flavor. It's not going to overwhelm or be a prominent flavor, but it will add a nice hue to the stew. And then I'm going to add about half a teaspoon of a hot pepper. I use a piment d'Espelette, which is just a French hot pepper, crushed hot pepper, but you could use a little bit of cayenne if you prefer, or you could use red pepper flakes. And now I'm going to start adding some liquid. So I'll start with 2.5 cups of broth. This is vegetable broth. You could use chicken broth. And then I'm going to add 1/2 cup of white wine. This will add nice flavor and a nice bit of acidity to the broth. We'll get that mixed in. Then I'm going to add a couple of tablespoons of tomato paste. Now that it's nice and soupy, I am going to nestle the chicken in among the vegetables. I've turned the heat up a little bit, so we'll let this come to a simmer. We don't need it in a full-on boil, but we'll just let it come to a simmer. So it will finish cooking the vegetables and it'll cook the chicken through. I'm going to flip the chicken a couple of times through the cooking process, but for now, we'll just let it sit and simmer away, and then we'll get started on our buttery molasses biscuits. I almost forgot the bay leaf. I'm just going to tuck 1 bay leaf in among the chicken thighs. The recipe for these buttery molasses biscuits is really speedy, so we have lots of time to put them together while the stew finishes cooking. We're going to start by combining the wet ingredients. So 1 cup of milk or buttermilk or soured milk. I have soured my milk with 1 tablespoon of plain yogurt. So with my measuring cup, I put 1 tablespoon of plain yogurt in it, and then I topped it up to the 1 cup level with just plain 2% milk. To that, I'm going to add 1 egg, room temperature. Always best to bake with room temperature eggs. We'll just whisk that. When it's no longer stringy, then I'll add the next ingredient, and that is 1/4 cup of molasses. Molasses is a great kind of sweet for biscuits because it isn't too sweet. It's almost a bit of a savory sweet, or has a bit of a spiciness to it almost. So we'll whisk those together. For the dry ingredients, we're going to combine 1 3/4 cups of all-purpose flour with 1 cup of whole wheat flour. For both the all-purpose flour and the whole wheat flour, I spooned it into the measuring cup first, and then I leveled the measuring cup to make sure I didn't end up with too much flour. So we have 2 kinds of flour. To that, I am going to add 1/2 teaspoon of baking soda, 2.5 teaspoons of baking powder, 1/2 teaspoon of salt, and 1/2 cup of toasted sunflower seeds. I'm just going to mix these well, and then I have 1/2 cup of very cold butter. I've cut it into chunks to make it a little easier to work into the dry mixture. And I'm using a pastry blender to mix it in with the flour. You could also do this in the food processor, just pulsing it gently, because you don't want the butter to get totally mixed in. You want it left in little pea-sized pieces. But a pastry blender works just fine. You could also work it in with your fingers, but I find this is a little easier. And it definitely makes it easier when your butter is nice and cold. This is a great biscuit recipe because you don't end up cutting the biscuits with a biscuit cutter. We're just going to roll it out, or roll the dough out into a rectangle, and then score it into squares, and then triangles. So we're not going to be working the dough too much, and that will mean that the texture of our biscuits will be really lovely. Now that our butter is well combined, I'm going to add the wet mixture. And I'm going to carefully combine it. With biscuits, you want to make sure that you don't overmix your dough, because then they could end up tough, or at least they won't be as tender as beautifully made biscuits can be. So I'm just going to mix it enough until there are just a few streaks of flour remaining. I'm just going to scrape it out of the bowl onto a lightly floured counter. Well, not lightly floured actually, because it's kind of a wet dough. But I will only use as much extra flour as necessary to keep the dough from being too sticky. And I'll just sprinkle it with flour. And I'm just going to work the dough a bit. It's great. I can feel the little chunks of butter, which is exactly how I want it to be. And I'm only going to knead it maybe 8 to 10 times. The dough is easy enough to work with now. I'm just going to clean up the flour so I can get the cookie sheet over here to get the dough shaped and ready to bake. I've preheated the oven to 400 degrees, and I've lined my cookie sheet with parchment paper. So I'm just going to lay the dough on the baking sheet and make a rectangle that's a little smaller than a sheet of paper. So a rectangle that's about 7 inches by 10 inches. When you've got it the size that you want, we're just going to sprinkle over top 2 or 3 tablespoons of sunflower seeds. And I'm just going to pat them in a little bit, and that'll help keep them from falling off while they're baking. And one last step before they go in the oven, I'm just going to score these. You can just use a knife or a bench scraper. So I'm going to score it into 9 biscuits. But then I am going to score the biscuits on the angle, on the diagonal. And that gives people an option to have a smaller biscuit if they'd like. Now that they're shaped and scored, they will bake for 20 to 25 minutes. Our stew has been simmering away nicely, and the vegetables look like they're almost cooked. I just want to check on the chicken and see if it's cooked through. So not quite. Needs probably another 10 minutes of simmering. So that should line up very well with our biscuits. I am going to taste the broth and start to adjust the seasoning a bit. Remember, I haven't added salt yet, and there are a few other flavor tweaks that I'll tell you about. I'm going to start with salt, a teaspoon. We might end up needing a little bit more, but I'll start with that. And then I'm going to add about a teaspoon of anchovy paste. It's like a secret ingredient that I use just to add flavor that is, well, it's a secret ingredient. So you don't notice that there is a fish flavor or an anchovy flavor, but it just helps round out the overall flavor of the sauce in a stew. Now there's lots of broth here, you'll notice, but we still have 2 cups of cooked chickpeas to add, so that'll start to fill it in as well. And another ingredient I'm going to add is Worcestershire sauce, just a few splashes. We'll get those stirred together, and then I will taste the broth again. I'm going to wait until the chicken is pretty much cooked through before I add the chickpeas and then do any final flavor adjustments. I took a peek at our biscuits a minute ago and I know that they are ready. See how golden they are, and they have puffed up so beautifully. They're too hot to eat, so I'm just going to let them cool for a few minutes while I finish seasoning our stew. So I have just a couple of more things to do with the stew before it's ready. The first is to add about a tablespoon of molasses, just to mellow out there's a little bit of a tart flavor to the broth. Now another option is to add about a tablespoon or 2 of raisins through the whole cooking process, so they'll add some of those sweet notes just to balance some of the other flavors. And then I'm going to add 2 cups of cooked chickpeas. They add a lot more substance to this stew. They help it go a lot further. They add lots of fiber. So there's really a lot that is so good about a supper that combines protein like chicken and protein and fiber and nutrients like chickpeas, and then some vegetables. And we'll just let that simmer until the chickpeas are cooked through. And then I'm going to garnish it with a few herbs and we'll be ready to serve. I'm just going to stir in a little bit of chopped cilantro. You could use parsley instead, or even a little bit of basil. And then I will serve. If you'd like your stew to be a little thicker, you can always thicken it with additional flour, or you could use chickpea flour, or you could always just serve it over rice. And this stew should easily serve 4 to 6 people, and it goes beautifully with warm biscuits. This golden chicken stew makes a hearty, warming meal for a cool night, and serving it with these warm, buttery biscuits makes it extra special. This makes a wonderful weekend meal and is great for gatherings. Thanks for watching.